I was very lucky to meet what I call the normal human being, and not the aberrant human being that's a product of Western civilization. Western civilization wants to destroy face-to-face relationships, so everything is mediated through electronics.
Professor John Collins. From the bomb-scarred streets of 1950s Bristol to musical adventures across Ghana and West Africa, he spent a lifetime documenting the history of high life in West African popular music. But as Westernization takes hold, he speaks for what's being lost: community, sustainable traditions, and a connection to nature.
The streets are also for people to meet. You cannot meet a white person on the street in England. If you go to a white person and try to, they'll say you're accosting them and have you arrested even. I would store water in a porcelain pot and it cools the water. Every house had one of these. There was no disposable plastic. They used leaves to wrap the food, and this was completely normal. The Europeans are experts at using architecture to destroy people. But that dream of having cities only built for cars was transmitted to Accra. So that what they just did is they built highways through communities. I mean, it's unbelievable. In fact, what we're seeing in Europe is the gradual imprisonment of everybody, because the prison is the model of the future society.
I'm just imagining your life in England. What was it like, and what led to you, and I'm supposing your family, moving to Ghana? What was life in England like?
Okay, I was born at the end of the war, and bombs were still dropping, German bombs and V1s and V2 rockets. In fact, the nursing home where I was born in Kensington was destroyed by a bomb about 2 or 3 days after I left. My father and my mother had met in London during the war. Actually, they were poets. There was a poetic community in London. It included people like Dylan Thomas and John Tesserman, and there were some jazz musicians around. Anyway, there was a community of sort of poetic bohemians. They used to call them bohemians in those days, free thinkers. But they were very poor. But then my dad got a job doing a degree at Cambridge University in philosophy. So I remember just before we went to stay in Cambridge, that was about 1949. We'd been staying in Sandgate first. When I was born, I can hardly remember that period. And my father was doing some business. Then we're living quite well because the business was doing well. Then my father wasn't really a businessman, so it collapsed. And we fell into poverty overnight from bankruptcy, I believe.
You said you were doing well. Like, how well?
Well enough for me to have a nanny, for us to have a silver ghost Rolls-Royce car and a Dalmatian dog.
Wow.
I mean, so we live a life of luxury.
That's like a movie.
Yeah. But we plunged into
Poverty.
because I think my father was duped by his partner. And then we were living for a little bit with my grandmother in the poor area of Bedminster in Bristol. And then we went and even lived for a while in a bus, in a camp for gypsies and traveling people. My father's generation at Cambridge University, there were two generations. One were the people who were about 18, had just come from school. And there was this whole bunch of older students who, because of the war, they hadn't finished their education and they came back. So that's my father's friends. They were maybe 7 or 8 years older than the typical student. And what happened is that when Ghana got internal self-rule under Nkrumah, the government decided to upgrade Achimota College to a full university. And they did this by, one of the tricks, or one of the ways they did this, was they hired a lot of expatriate new graduates. And they preferred, obviously, slightly mature people. I think that they brought them from Oxford and Cambridge, and my father was one of those. So as soon as they got their degree, they got the job, to help start Legon University. It wasn't at Legon. I remember my father actually pointing out Legon to me in a car and say, this is going to be where the new university is. And it was just a forested hill. The only place operating at Legon at that time I can remember was there was a primary school for the children of expatriates, because there were quite a lot of expatriates helping, engineers and people like this, and lecturers like my dad. So that's how he came to Ghana.
And he came with the whole family?
Mother, yes, they were married and everything.
Yeah.
So I had two younger brothers. She was a bohemian, a free thinker. She was quite socialistic. In fact, even my father was socialistic. But she wasn't very happy with the colonial setup particularly for a woman. Back in those days, if you came as a white man, say a white colonial man, we're just coming out of colonialism at the time, but a lot of the trappings of colonialism were still there. There was very little role for a woman, except to be a hausfrau, a housewife with servants. And it was more free. A man was more free back in those days. And my mother felt too restricted, cloistered. And she was very artistic. She was a poet. She was and doing paintings and things like this. So she didn't like Ghana. It was too colonial for her, basically. But my father loved it because it was a man's world back in those days, but not a woman's. I'm talking about white expatriate women.
I'm sure it was quite the adventure for him as well.
Well, he fell in love with the country. Ultimately, of course, he married a Ghanaian, my Auntie Amma, but that was some years later. But so basically, my mum took me back, deposited me and my brothers with my granny in Bedminster in Bristol, which was a working class area. And that's where I met my first real community. I made my first friends. I can even still remember some of them, even today. And we had a street gang. You see, there were a lot of bombed out houses because of the war. Bristol was a port city, so the Germans dropped a lot of bombs on Bristol. So there were lots of places for us to play. Bombed outs, bomb sites we used to call them, I think. And even, in fact, sometimes we even stopped by the police. Whether it was to protect us from falling masonry or because we were bad, I don't know.
Whilst you were playing with your friends, were you going to high school at that time, or you were still very young?
No, it was primary school.
Primary school.
And it was a very, very backward. I was taught to write copperplate writing with pen and ink. Has been taught to students for 200 or 300, 400 years. Luckily, they didn't beat me for being left-handed because my mother had warned them, because they'd beaten my mother at that school or another Bristol school when she was a small girl for using a left hand. And it put her education back about 2 or 3 years. It confused her because she was already beginning to read and write. In fact, my mother in the end ran away from Bristol because her future was to work in a tobacco factory, like the rest of my Bristolian family. All of my family on my mother's side were industrial workers in various types of factories, making jam, making cigarettes or whatever. And nobody had gone any further than that. That's why the schooling system in Bedminster, where I went, didn't really teach more than writing and arithmetic. And in fact, I would have never got into a grammar school if it hadn't been for my stepfather a bit later. But the funny thing about that period is that I discovered a library. So I was able to start reading, and I would spend a lot, I suppose I was a bit starved of information. Nothing like internet. So you have to go physically to discover what a library is. And I remember all the first books I read, or really, I was excited by them, were on Greek and Nordic mythology. It was like these superheroes in the past, like Superman today or Batman. But these were ancient examples.
But what about the community?
I can give you an example. Right now, in 1953, Queen Elizabeth was coronated as Queen of Britain when she was quite young. And every street, particularly in working class districts in England, they did exactly what Ghanaians do when they have a funeral. They close off the street, and then they have a party. They put chairs and tables down the middle of the street, and everybody contributes whatever. And all the streets were doing this. And I'd only been in Britain about 4 or 6 months coming back from Ghana when I met this. And then everybody got drunk and disorderly and had parties, and old ladies were throwing their legs up in the air.
Sounds exactly like Ghana.
I remember now, when I think about it, when I met street parties or funerals in Ghana itself much later, I did recall that I'd met this in Britain, but it has basically died out. It's possible that this new King, Charles, it may have happened. But the thing is that, you see, what the British did in between Queen Elizabeth and King Charles is they basically destroyed the working class areas. Terraced houses living next together, like the boys in my gang, we were all neighbors. We were a neighborhood gang. It's what in America they call a hood, a neighborhood. So all of that disappeared because the British went into this policy of breaking up they didn't only just try to break up the trade unions and heavy industry, they broke up the working class communities by forcing people to go into high-rise flats that looked wonderful, and they were actually shit. I mean, for human beings. I mean, it created generations of disturbed children. I won't go into this, but I think in Britain they actually in the end had to start demolishing some of these high-rise flats, because they discovered that normal families who go in, coming from a community, working class communities, they were fragmented, bottled up, put into these high-rise flats. And maybe they would have said, okay, this is civilization, because you have hot and cold running water or something. But it was the children it affected. So they actually started blowing these places up. So I don't know whether that tradition of street parties continued, because basically the British didn't want any type of community on the street. The white man civilization, what they like to do is the streets are going from A to B, but not for loitering, not for standing still, not for talking to people. They have a different concept. And even the Notting Hill Carnival that started in the 60s or 50s, they resisted that, the police, because they didn't want the streets used for social community purposes. Of course, it's completely different in Africa. I'm sure the British colonialists, when they were here, they got annoyed with all these funerals and so on, but they would say, because they're blocking off access. British will always use an argument that if you're cutting the streets, you don't allow the access, which a street is for, but they've forgotten that streets are also for people to meet. You cannot meet a white person on the street in England. If you as a stranger go up to a typical, maybe it affects us the West Indians, but not so much, I think. But if you go to a white person and they'll say you're accosting them and have you arrested even. You can't actually bump into somebody and because you're only on a street in England to go from A to B. You're thinking about the person in the future, the friend you're going to meet. You're not thinking about all the people you may meet in between. And of course, if you're on a subway, it's even worse. You're a troglodyte, you're living underground. So when I was a bit older, I actually went to a school and I had to go there every day by underground. And in the end, it became normal behavior for me. But I don't recall ever seeing anybody I knew or striking up a conversation underground with the other troglodytes. So the system in Britain was to break up communities using roads and transport systems, as is happening here in Ghana with the highways.
So, Professor, after your mother took you back to England, you came back to Ghana eventually. Why?
Oh, that's a long story. I mean, yeah, my mother married another guy, my Canadian, who had been a friend of my dad's. He was the one who detected that I have some intelligence because I was already reading mythology. So he pushed me through the 11 plus exams. So I was able to go to grammar school. I went to 4 different grammar schools. One of my problems is I went to different schools, so it's difficult for me to make friends. Every 2 or 3 years we move and so on. But anyway, what happened in the end is I did a degree in medicine. And because I'm very, very interested in biology and the sciences, but particularly biology. So I did naturally what everybody would do, want to become a doctor. And it was okay for a couple of years. But after going into hospital work, particularly training, I detected that the medical profession was full of sort of hypocrites, in the sense that you're going there to save people's lives, and it draws on that spirit in a person to help. But in fact, the hospitals are organized like military camps with hierarchies and doctors and different layers of nurses and so on. And also we were taught not to be too friendly to the students, not the students, the patients. We have to detach ourselves. And I found that it was a most alien type of organ. I couldn't believe that this is from a medical student, because I didn't have the patience to realize that after that I could become a GP. But at that time I saw everybody wanted to become surgeons, and the surgeons were the most arrogant people of all. I consider surgeons to be basically plumbers of the human body, but because of their saving lives, they become very pompous. And and at the same time, I was becoming more and more socialistic and joining all sorts of socialist movements that were opposing the Vietnam War and supporting the dockers in a dockers strike, trade union struggles. And so in the end, I wanted to go to Cuba for my elective, which is a communist country. And I revealed to the profession that I was that way inclined, in terms of being a socialist. And so they sort of put me through a punishment routine with some very reactionary doctors who bullied me. Because at that time, we didn't have any radical students. There were, in the whole, we had about 100 students, or let's say 80 students taking medicine in my group. And only 5 of us were socialist. And I saw all my other friends turning into capitalists because that was part of becoming a doctor. So there was a split. I won't go there. I had a sort of a mystical experience, if you can call it that, at an operation when I was the assistant anaesthetist. You know, I was a small boy, so I could leave the operation. It wouldn't have had any effect on the operation. I was under training. But the surgeon was insulting people, young people, long-haired people who were socialist, telling how he'd seen some people when he was driving his car to work, and he had to resist himself from killing them, driving through them, a group of long-haired layabouts. These are my type of friends. So I walked out. But then after, I worked in an engineering factory, and then in a brewery factory for a couple of years, but realized, because I wanted to become a trade union person, but found that life wasn't suitable for me. And then luckily, I heard my brother had gone to Ghana by land, actually. Patrick went by land. Yes. So I decided to leave Britain, basically, altogether, and join Patrick and my father. And I was coming here to actually complete my medical degree. I was in my 4th year, so I was expecting to come here, maybe go back 1 year, catch up. And then I found Corley Boo had only just started, and they insisted I go back to the beginning. So I said to myself, well, I'm in Ghana, I'm not going to leave, because I'd already gone on the road with the band by then, met my mother, my stepmother and everybody. I didn't want to leave Ghana even after 2 weeks or a month. So I decided to switch to some topics which will cover the history of Ghana, which is political science, sociology, and archaeology. So I took those as a BA. So that's really what I switched from one degree to another, to social sciences. But I dropped political science because I was pro Nkrumah, and the Ghanaian intellectuals at that time hated Nkrumah. They believed all the lies the Americans and the French and the British were saying about Nkrumah drinking baby's blood or using horrible occults. So they made all sorts of lies about Nkrumah. And I'd read some of his books, and I was impressed by him because in England, I'd been with the left club, so I knew some of the top writers in Marxism, you know, whether, I don't know, I'm thinking of some people like Fanon, Frantz Fanon. I won't mention their names, but Nkrumah was there. And you just don't believe that this guy would be dabbling in occult powers to remain in power.
Yeah, and of course, and now we know that from the CIA reports.
It was fabricated, yes. Yes. And the CIA has even revealed these secrets openly, publicly. They've revealed the documents where they bribed certain Ghanaian military men and policemen to overthrow Nkrumah for $20,000. Betray their country for $20,000. Anyway, we won't go into that. So
your gut was right.
Yeah.
So, Professor, you lived with your father and your brother in Ghana.
Yes.
Was it on this land? How did this land
No,
come
this
into the
land,
picture?
my father didn't actually acquire this land. I think actually acquired it in 1967, but he just had a mud hut and a farm. This was all bush where we are now. Nothing at all, nothing at all. It's hard to believe. But we lived with my father in 2 different places. He stayed at Legon. And even when I first came back to Ghana to be with my dad, I didn't stay in a hall of residence, except for a short period of time. I stayed with a friend. But basically, I was with my dad, and he was living in a community, which is all of his family people. So even in his house in Legon, there were about 10 or 12 people staying there.
Okay, of his wife's family?
Some were helpers who were sort of... my father helped a lot of young people get through college. There's even one guy in Alaboshi called College, because my father pushed him through college. You know, so he did a lot of that type of thing. So he always had a community. And so one of the reasons why I often say to some American friends who come here, or my foreign friends who come to Ghana, maybe they're coming to explore music or do a degree. I said, look, my situation was very different from anybody else because I was dropped straight inside a Ghanaian family. I came to visit this place. Still got a picture, about 1971. and there's just a mud hut here, a mud hut. And then a lot of farming. And even my father didn't live here. He still lived in Legon. I think he must have built his house here by the late 70s. Because he was coming up to retirement age, he decided also to put a very humble cottage, a farmhouse here as well. But I still didn't live here. But at that time, I was living in Jamestown, and I was running a band. I wasn't even thinking of being with my dad. But my brother was here with his Ghanaian wife. So I think when I moved in here, I'd taken my band to Britain, worked with unemployed West Indians, teaching them African music, came back with equipment for my band, for recording, etc. And then discovered that the house I was staying in Jamestown had been rented out, even though I'd paid for it. And at the same time, some of the men working here in my father's house, my father had traveled, I think, they said that some people are trying to encroach on the land, and they really wanted somebody here. So I actually reluctantly came here and left my house in Jamestown, where I was running a band. And I had a community there. That was a big house too. Afro-Indian family, all sorts of people in the house, maybe 20 people. Then my own friends who used to come and stay. So I was always from one community to another. I never lived in lonely splendor, like the European model of living.
Okay, I'm interested to know, what were the cultural differences that stood out when you arrived in Ghana? Like, as you kept living in Ghana, what did you notice was different from living in England?
Well, many, many things. I mean, one thing I immediately noticed, that there was no racism in Ghana. Sometimes Ghanaians don't like each other for other reasons, like tribalism or family matters or whatever. But one of the things I always half expected, I'm a white, ex-colonial, there'd be some resentment. And I never saw that here. So when I was taken on trek with a band, I was more seen as a novelty factor, a white person playing African music. And I was a sort of treasure for them and making a little bit of money. And I only got to know them through my father and my stepmother. All of that happened because of my connections with my Ghanaian family. That glimpse into playing from village to village. So that was something, just to give you some examples. I mean, I remember playing at a funeral with the Jaguar Jokers guitar band. And I had to sit down with the leader and explain to him, is it correct to be playing this type of jolly music for party time, getting drunk and disorderly at a funeral? Because I'd never gone to a funeral in England that wasn't a somber sort of Christian affair or whatever. And they said, no, that's what we do in Ghana. Once we buried the body, we jubilate. So there were those types of things. Also, for the first time, I worked with drag queens. I'd never met those types of things.
We had drag queens.
Well, they didn't call, you see, they weren't, in fact, I was hesitant in using that word because it immediately thinks transsexual. It was nothing like that. What happened is the concert parties were traveling from village to village. They weren't urban, they were mainly rural. So they moved from the rural areas with carrying their own electricity. And after the performance, you sleep on the floor. And it wouldn't have been safe for a woman to travel with these bands. So what they did from the 1950s, they created this tradition of some of the men with slightly high voices singing like women or dressing like women. And they were incredibly
Entertaining.
Not just entertaining, they really knew the psychology of the women. In fact, my father played a joke on one of his friends at the university, a white guy, took him to a concert party, and the guy fell in love with one of the girls on the stage, and my father forgot to tell him it's a man. So the guy went into shock later on. But the thing is, what I noticed, this is why I didn't use the word drag queens. These guys, there wasn't any hint of homosexuality with these guys. What they were the heaviest womanizers I've ever met, because they knew the psychology of a man and they knew the psychology of a woman, and the women loved them. They loved all the concert party actors and musicians. The women would flock, but particularly I noticed to the female impersonators. That's what we used to call them in Ghana. So that was a thing. And also I was playing ragtime music, which is a music that's died out about 50 years ago in Europe or America. So I was meeting all of these things, there was also the fact that the guitarists didn't have a lead guitar, which suited, I'm basically a musical anarchist. I don't believe in hierarchies like in a hospital. So I was very relieved that one didn't have to be a solo superstar. We didn't have solo superstars in those days. I think they were very, very friendly and inclusive people, including the way they accepted me into a band. In Europe, we tend to, it's always exclusive friendships or something like this, or everything is this and that, good or bad, or they divide everything. But in Ghana, everything was inclusive. It's the same with the music.
Fine, fine, baby. Your mother.
If you're playing a rhythm and somebody puts another rhythm on top, it doesn't interfere with the product. It makes it richer. Europeans would say, get off my music and go and play your own music, or it doesn't fit in with my music. And so I met this musically, this inclusiveness, and in the friendship I found here. I mean, I found a sort of an automatic friendship or neighbourliness or brotherly or sisterly love, which I never actually saw. I'm talking about generalized, not one person or somebody that you're very close to. I mean, of course, you're close to your mother and father and so on, and you're in England, and some few people who are your good friends. But here, it's like friendship was dissipated widely, or love, neighbourliness. And in a way, I'm very, very lucky that I saw this in my life, because the British had gradually wiped this out. You do find neighbourhoods, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the working class neighbourhoods were destroyed on purpose. The factories were demolished, the houses were demolished. You put people in isolated little boxes, this type of thing. I never met this. I met village life, if I can put it, which is really, when all is said and done, how the human beings have been for at least the last 10,000 years. And I also met hunters. Some of my friends were hunters, which is an older tradition that goes back 300,000 years. So I was very lucky to meet what I call the normal human being, and not the aberrant human being that's a product of Western civilization.
So when you were in Ghana, plastic did not exist. What did Ghanaians do?
Of course, we had plastic utensils, but it wasn't throwaway disposable plastic. So we did have some plastic plates, metal plates, cups. But we had a lot of porcelain and clay, because we had a lot of potters here. In fact, just at Wedger, I had a friend who had a potter friend, and I think they were making pottery in Dome as well. I myself, for many years before I had a fridge, I would store water in a porcelain pot, and you just put the water in, and the porcelain evaporates during the day slightly. It's not glazed porcelain, and it cools the water. Every house had one of these. Sometimes they would put something in to keep it clean, but basically everybody. And if you were on the street and you needed water, there were these women who would sell water on their heads, and they would have a calabash cup or a plastic cup or whatever, and you would just scoop out. And they also had this, is it called asana? Yes. Sometimes they would have a block of ice floating in it. And if you went to buy things, there was no disposable plastic. This was a very recent invention, or at least introduction to Ghana. For instance, if you buy things from the street, they used leaves to wrap the food. And this was completely normal, whether kenki or whatever it was always leaves.
Did people used to take their own plates to buy food from, let's say, like chop bars or something?
Not normally. If you wanted chop bar, you just eat on the spot. You didn't go and collect things from a chop bar. But what you could do is those things that kenki and so on, or wache or whatever, then you can take it to your house, but it would be wrapped in leaves. So the introduction of plastic, I can't actually put a date to when it started doing.
What would be the substitute for something like a bag?
Oh, for instance, just taking bags, for instance. I mean, there were very, very cheap bags that were made in the north with a type of fiber. They're not as strong, they're like rope bags, with sort of slight holes in them. They're woven, and they could expand to enormous size. That's how I carried everything up to maybe, I don't know when I stopped doing it, maybe when I came to stay here. But I always had this type of bag.
And they have like a sling?
Yeah, it's a sling bag.
Okay.
And people would use different types of, we had a lot of people making these things then. You can't even, right now, if you want to get a string bag, you have to go to the north. It wasn't originally just the north. Everybody was, it's like a lot of people think the northern people are more old-fashioned than the south. Everybody was old-fashioned, but it's the north. Let's take the drink Pito, which is a traditional drink. This drink is a type of beer. This drink, according to my father, was except for palm wine, which is another drink, local drink, they had Pito in the south and the north. But because beer and such stuff like this came in later through colonialism, then in our sort of minds, we always think of Pito as being something from the north. When you go to the north, back in those days, all the houses were round. The original Ghanaian houses were round. We didn't have square houses. We didn't have such a thing as a square house.
Did you see that?
Yes. Alaboshi, which is just a few miles from here, which I used to visit when I was about an 8-year-old child. I even went to a traditional dance there with my nurse girl and so on. Some of the houses were still round. The only houses that you still see round now in Alaboshi is the fetish, the traditional religious house. They maintain the roundness. But all houses were round because they're more economical and efficient to build and stronger structurally. It was the Europeans. This is why I think the black Americans call whites squares. Everything is squared off in white society. Yeah, I mean, I believe right now in Sierra Leone, they're freaking out because all the houses are made of tin, including the sides. They're not even made of cement and tin. It's tin and tin. And everybody's baking. Nobody knows what to do because of global warming.
That's crazy.
Well, of course, because they've lost the old ways of surviving in heat. Thick mud walls, maybe 1 foot thick, and thatch. I think you're even forbidden to build. My father tried to build some mud huts here when he was first here. And in the end, when he had to develop his own house, it was forbidden in Greater Accra to make a house of swish. It was forbidden. You wouldn't get a building permit. So you can say that in a sense.
Yeah, so some of the older sustainable indigenous technology has been forced out.
Yeah, but forced out by European concepts of squaring off things. You know, when I first built my recording studio here, it was made of swish, and we still had people around who knew how to build. You know, swish is quite complicated. You have to tread the mud, and you have to get expert people who can notice a change in the scent of the mud as you're pressing it with your feet.
That's the traditional method.
Yeah, and then at a certain point, there's a change in the smell of the mud, and then it's ready to be used for. Yeah. So it's not just you mix water and mud. There's a chemical changes, and you can detect it with your nose. Yeah. These people have all gone. Yeah, I wanted to say another thing. I noticed this white clay that women chew. I'm sure you have it in Nigeria. I've forgotten what we call it in Ghana. And, you know, in Britain, I think it happened to my mother. She told me that when women get very funny tastes when they're pregnant, and she went for tomatoes or something, but some people even eat coal or clay or something. And it was something like a pathological syndrome in pregnant women. I discovered that it's completely normal. Women have been doing it for thousands of years, presumably in West Africa. They eat the clay because it's got minerals in it. So women are eating not coal, but in this case clay. But it's not seen as an aberration. They probably don't know the reason for it. They say it settles the stomach, but in fact it's a folk remedy for getting more vitamins and minerals into your bloodstream for your baby. But in European, they turn a lot of very normal things into pathologies. So if I went to Britain, when I talk to my friends and say, you know, this white clay, they say, oh, the one that the traditional priests use for making themselves white. I say, it's not only for that. It's pregnant women use this clay. You mean they eat clay? I said, yes, they eat clay. And then they will probably remember in Britain, they have to try and stop pregnant women eating soil or clay or charcoal or coal. Things like that. It's an atavistic feeling amongst women that they need minerals from the ground for their babies.
That's cool. And I can imagine that in Accra back then, in your time, there were a lot more trees than they are now.
Oh, you can't even compare it. Yeah. I mean, the great tree cuts. I mean, we're living right now in the middle of sawmillers who hate trees, except to cut them down and make money from them. And this area wasn't a forest area. It was a bush, you know, Sahel, because around Accra is Sahel. But I mean, the tragedy of Ghana is the cutting down of the trees. Yeah, this was an open house. This was in virgin land. There was a village, maybe 2 miles in this direction. There was a village about 3 miles in this direction, 5 miles in this. That was about it. So we didn't have any problem with security, and we didn't have any trouble with flooding. So we were never flooded, because my father built this place here because there's a river that runs maybe about 200 or 300 feet away from here, traditionally. And the development of this area really started in the 70s with the building of Taifa across the road under the Achampong era. Gradually, more and more people came, and then they came on this side. And what everybody did is they blocked all the rivers. And then the sawmillers came and blocked all the rivers. So we started to get flooding. So my first wall were actually embankments against flooding. And then, of course, we had security problems. The sawmillers are very clannish. So it's not that easy to become very friendly with them, because they're not living in their villages. They're living in Accra, where it's every man for himself, and God help the rest. I mean, there's no community spirit. The only places you might find community spirit still in Accra is in the Ga enclaves. There's parts of Dome and parts of Jamestown where you still get a traditional, maybe community spirit. But that's how Jamestown used to be when I was there. But in these new Wild West areas, it's rugged individualism run amok. And so because of the security, but I didn't build these walls for security purposes. They were basically to stop flooding. And then, of course, I put barbed wire because a lot of these people were moving into the area, and there were robberies and things like this. So it was never my plan. And when we were living here first, when I came here in the 1980s, we had a household of about 15 people. I inherited some from my dad, the workers and so on, because I was still running my father's farm to some extent for a few years. And then people related to my first wife and so on, and other musicians who stayed here. Quite a lot of musicians stayed here. It was quite a natural community, because if you're living on your own and there's a lot of bush around, you need people around. But gradually, as time went on, people moved into the area, destroyed the environment, cut down all the trees, caused flooding, and then, of course, the nightmare of the roads. And they didn't put any decent gutters. So the flooding became worse. And on top of that, they built a road with walls, I think there's 4 lanes, 4 highway lanes with walls in between. So it's impossible to walk across or cross the road. So what has happened here is that all the way from Achimota to Ofanko, except for 2 places where there's a roundabout, basically this side of Accra has been cut off from that side of Accra. And they've followed the white man foolishness brought forward by that monster, Henry Ford, who, was the great hero of automatic production and automatic factories and so on, but also hated public transport. And he was a fascist. He was a pro-Hitler guy. I don't want to go into his horrible type of person he was. But that dream of having a cities only built for cars was transmitted to Accra. And so that what they just did is they built highways through communities. I mean, it's unbelievable. So I have a friend across the other side of the road called Sammy Teti. I hardly see him these days.
Tom was telling me that he used to be able to just cross over and go and visit people like on the other side.
Yeah, that was
this was a real community.
It was this particular road that was built about 10, 15 years ago, where they put walls in between. You have to be something like a goat to jump over the walls if you dare, No, they've effectively basically divided this side from the other side. Yeah. And it's all the way along for 3 mile stretch in a city.
And it's also very dangerous as well. We always have like accidents happening.
We've had 3 people being killed leaving this house.
Ghanaians in general, we young people, we think and look at highways as modernity. Oh, this is like, we're improving our roads, and people don't really know. I didn't know the effects or the side effects of having highways. It's disrupting communities.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole, using architecture to destroy human beings. It's like building high-rise flats. Instead of working working class neighborhoods of terraced houses where you have communities. You destroy that, you put them into high-rise flats. The Europeans are experts at using architecture to destroy people. Look, all the straight roads in America, in the cities, they have blocks. It's modeled on the French system. All the roads in Europe, and probably the world, were higgledy-piggledy at first because the cities grew hodgepodge. There was no planning.
It's just an organic thing.
Yeah, but what the French decided to do is have straight lines in the cities because of the French Revolution. Because during the French Revolution, they realized, because of that experience, that if you could get big guns at both sides of a straight line, you can shoot everybody in between. And that was the architecture of the block system. It was a militarization of buildings or architecture. And then that was taken to America as a standard. So you don't have higgledy-piggledy, because if you have higgledy-piggledy roads, it's very easy to set up barricades and have a revolution. Oh yeah, I mean, I went to a university in America, SUNY Buffalo, that had originally been in Buffalo itself, the city. And because Buffalo was a place where a lot of people running away from the Vietnam War to Canada would cross over to Canada, young people dodging, having to fight the Viet Cong. So what they did is they rebuilt the whole university outside of the town, and they used fascist architecture. When I say fascist architecture, the design was based on that of a prison. Prisons are, in fact, what we're seeing in Europe is the gradual imprisonment of everybody, because the prison is the model of the future society. And it's ways of, well, of course, in a prison, you might want to keep the people isolated. But what they did in this university is that there are buttresses on the walls, so you can't scale the walls. There are no central meeting points in the university where the students could meet and plot revolution or plot protest. And it's actually designed, and I was told, because it's a very unpleasant place to live, because there's no central places where the students meet. There are no crossroads. There are intersections which sort of go in the sky. You go this way, I go this way. And for hundreds of years, it hasn't been going on just now. But what's horrible, it's been brought to Ghana.
So, Professor, with many traditional communities disappearing in modern Ghana today, how can people rebuild a sense of community and foster meaningful connections? What do you think?
I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, one thing is that luckily most Ghanaians still have some connection with their rural families. Of course, this is getting less so. So the one thing is to always maintain connections with members of your extended family who live in the rural areas. That's one possibility. You see, I don't know if this thing can be stopped, because we're setting up an inhuman society. I don't mean in Ghana. I mean, we've already done it in the West. And even if you take China or India, those countries, they're also following the same path of squeezing more and more human beings into a small space. And experiments have shown that if you take animals and you shorten the space or reduce the space gradually, there's a point when the animals will turn on each other. They've done this experiment with rats. Every creature needs a certain amount of space, and then you can squeeze the space more and more, and there's a certain point. And I think in a lot of urban places, we've reached that point where people are turning against each other. But you can always find spaces, even in the heart of this type of mechanical or materialistic. You can, for instance, you can find psychological spaces or social spaces or gardens. The Europeans, when they recognized the problems of squeezing people into smaller and smaller spaces, always maintained a tradition of big parks and gardens. Even in the center, Manhattan, you see, the Ghanaians threw this away because they wanted to be like the white people in terms of urbanization. And they thought that they never took, I think Ghanaians took nature for granted. This is the real problem. So they never tried to preserve nature. This is why there's very little sense of ecological concern in Ghana, because Mother Nature has always been very bountiful to Ghanaians. The Europeans, it hasn't been like that. We only have one harvest a year, for instance. So I think one of the problems is that these changes that have happened in Ghana have happened so fast, whereas it took maybe 400 or 500 years in Europe. The Europeans had chance to acclimatize, create parks and gardens and other devices. But the Ghanaians, it's happened so quick, they haven't had a chance. And so I don't know how they're going to do. I can't give you an answer for this, except that I was very lucky that I got a piece of land from my father, but I've had a big fight with people to keep this place intact. In fact, it's not even intact. Some area of my father's land was seized by some people.
So it seems like there's little to no hope on how to.
Oh no,
physical communities.
well, one answer, of course, is to do with music and dance. You see, the tendency in Western society, this atomization of people, is to have some people who play music and others, most of the others consume music. And you don't even sometimes even consume music with a group. If you look at the raves and what's happened with Afrobeats and so on in America or Europe, there's always an attempt by the youth to form communities, even if they're only in a factory, unused factory for one day. They'll take over the factory, have a rave there. I mean, the police hated, of course, they used to break them up. So the main thing is that one answer is that the youth and people generally should have places where they can meet, congregate, and have musical or religious experiences together in a friendly way.
Yeah, can you continue to play the rhythm? The rhythm?
That's why the hip life thing used to scare me when it first came out, because it was mimed. Burger high life and hip life was mimed. So it meant that you didn't actually have an interaction with a live band, and sometimes you didn't even dance. You just watched the superstar. Everything in Europe is pushing certain people towards superstarism, and everybody else becomes a consumer. Like America now being controlled, by 4 billionaires or 5 billionaires. Everybody else is just a consumer. So people will have to form their own societies, dancing societies, spiritual societies, environmental societies, religious societies, mystical, anything, where they come together face to face. This is what Western civilization wants to destroy. It wants to destroy face-to-face relationships. So everything is mediated through electronics, which the government can turn off with cut the switch.
If we want to rebuild true community, we can't wait for someone else to do it. In a world shaped by individualism, speed, and consumption, natural community has been eroded, and it's up to us to bring it back, intentionally, face to face. It might start small, a weekly walking group, a neighborhood jam session, a tree planting initiative, or tending a community garden. Or maybe it's dreaming bigger, building an eco-village, a school, or a space where people and nature thrive together. Honestly, we're still figuring this all out. But that's the journey we're on. And if it speaks to you, we'd love for you to join us. On the left, you find our journey into sustainable living, and on the right, our mindset on navigating a tough economy through simple living.